This is the Squared Circle Psychobabble. Michael Valenti alongside Ralph Valenti. And in this week in WWE history, Chris Jericho debuted on Monday Night Raw. One of the biggest debuts in wrestling history. Where does it rank among the best? Now, we're going to talk about some of our favorite ones. Ralph, we'll start with you. And one of your personal favorite ones was actually a hometown guy in a big pay-per-view at WWE against an undefeated Kurt Angle.
Right.
Talk us through it. Your first favorite debut.
Right. So the one that I have at the top of my list made it for personal choices more than the lasting impact that it had on the industry itself. But this was actually Tazz's debut. All right. So this happened at Royal Rumble 2000. And like you mentioned, it came against Kurt Angle, who at the time was undefeated. This actually opened up the show, and it was at Madison Square Garden, so Tazz was actually the hometown guy there, right, being from Brooklyn. So for those of the people who don't know Tazz, he was the heavyweight champion in ECW, really well known. He had dropped the belt, I think, a week before this to RVD in a really big feud, and he made his debut against Kurt. Kurt Angle went out there, pretty much cut a promo, crapped all over New York, said that he was going to be their champion. You know, he did the thing that Kurt Angle does best, and he played the villain. And he went out there, meaning Tazz. He came out as soon as that music hit. The fans knew exactly who it was. So you saw the 13 on the screen there, and you saw the towel over his head. And it made for a really cool moment, especially because he was so well known by the New York fans. So it got a really cool reaction. He did end up choking out Kurt Angle, which ended up being a whole part of their feud going forward.
Right, because Kurt Angle didn't tap out.
Exactly, yeah. So it really worked well. They didn't put on the greatest match. I mean, it was about 8 minutes, but there was a lot of cool suplexes in it. Really hard hitting. So, being a fan of Tazz and ECW when I was younger, this is one of the reasons why it made it to the top of my list.
Now, obviously, we'll keep it in ECW with one of my personal favorites,
okay.
And that is Brian Pillman. When he came to ECW, the lights go out.
Right.
He's out there holding the cane,
yep.
And just cuts a huge promo, a shoot promo on WCW, how he hates it, and making fun of the marks and the smart marks, or as I like to call them, the mouth-breathing basement dwellers. It was such a great promo.
Such a subtle plug for yourself.
Exactly. So it was just a great promo there. And Brian Pillman, that was really the first taste of how people got to see a real Brian Pillman. Because he was so, he was doing the Hollywood Blondes with Steve Austin.
Right.
So there obviously people saw what he could do in the ring, but as a wild man character,
sure.
They only got a taste of it.
Sure. And the interesting thing is, and for people who maybe aren't as familiar with ECW, WCW and WWF back in the day, they didn't really have that edginess to them, and ECW really brought that. So when you saw Brian Pillman in the ring, and he really went in on WCW, and he said quite a few things about Eric Bischoff and the WCW, and how they were taking away his constitutional rights.
Right.
He cut a promo for a good 9 minutes, and the fans were just eating it up. That definitely goes down as one of my favorites, too. Brian Pillman, definitely an underrated guy, and amazing on the mic. Really interesting character, similar to Tommaso Ciampa, I think, in the psychological aspect.
Right.
Really good character and brought a lot to the table.
Now, another one that we obviously, both of us can obviously agree on, WCW's probably best debut was Scott Hall.
Sure.
In the whole outsider thing. And the great thing about this was, and even Eric Bischoff said it, because this was a time where the internet was not big yet. Many people were not aware of Dave Meltzer and rumors and all the other, there were dirt sheets out there, but they were in the form of a newsletter.
Yep.
We knew because our dad subscribed to the newsletter.
Correct.
So we had the idea. We knew it was happening, but a lot of fans didn't. And those that didn't know really thought Vince McMahon sent Scott Hall to WCW to invade.
Right.
And this was such a great angle and a great debut.
Right. And I have this on my list just because of the influence it had on the industry itself. When you look at the industry back then, WCW versus WWF, and even today, you see elements of the NWO throughout all of that. Without the NWO, would you really have the Attitude Era? Would you have had DX? Would you have had DX invading Nitro? It really brought out the best in both the companies because it forced Vince McMahon to look at his product and what he was presenting to his fans and say, all right, this isn't working. You know, and what the NWO was, like you mentioned, when they debuted at Bash at the Beach back in July, I believe it was 96, that was the first time in roughly 15 years that Hogan, who was the biggest face in the industry, debuted or came out as a heel.
Right,
you know, he debuted the persona of Hollywood Hogan, and I consider Hogan the biggest character and the most successful wrestler of all time, mostly because if you look at his body of work, right, he was the most successful face probably in the industry other than Stone Cold Steve Austin. Where those two differ is what they did as heels. Austin, when he turned heel in the WWF or WWE back in the day, it didn't really click with the fans. They didn't understand it. They didn't get it. And it really kind of hurt his career, I think. While Hogan in the NWO and what he did, he thrived in that. You know, and that was really some of his best work. And you look at what it did going forward. I mean, having the NWO come to the WWF, you had one of the greatest matches of all time, in my estimation, in Hogan versus Rock. One of the best matches of all time, if not one of the best matches at WrestleMania. Amazing moment. We were talking about moments before. That's one of them that's really up there on the list. And you look at wrestling today, you know, you've got the Bullet Club, who's heavily influenced by not just the Clique, but also the NWO. You know, so having that lasting effect. And we're talking about Chris Jericho. Without the NWO, and without the politics that were in WCW back in the day, you would not have had the mass exodus from WCW with the guys like Eddie Guerrero, Big Show, Ric Flair left because of the politics, and of course, Chris Jericho. He left because those guys that were at the top weren't making room for him, and Eric Bischoff wasn't going to give him that spot. So when you talk about the NWO, when you talk about Hogan or Nash or any of those guys that were up there at the top, that's part of one of the big reasons why Jericho had left and went to the WWE, and one of the big reasons why he was as successful as he was, because going there, he was able to really kind of branch out and show what he was made of.
You know, and the other great thing about Jericho's debut was they put him on in a prime spot. You know, they made it a big thing, you know, with the countdown and the millennium, and that it was 9/9/99. It was exactly 90 days from his no-compete clause, so they timed it out perfectly.
Right.
And he comes out after a promo with The Rock.
Yeah.
So you're instantly shot to main event status as soon as you're involved with The Rock, especially at that time.
Yep.
You know, where The Rock was in the main event. It was amazing, and it was a 10-minute segment with them, and Jericho went back and forth with The Rock, and who's one of the best talkers in the business, especially then. Obviously one of the best debuts that involved a promo. One of the other ones that obviously doesn't get a lot talked about because of where it was, but in TNA, I think one of the best wrestling debuts was Christian Cage. When he came out, they made that just as big of a thing. Like, oh, this is the big guy who jumped from WWE to Impact. And he comes out, the crowd, granted it was only about like 2,000, 3,000 people, but still, the crowd goes nuts. He comes out and he cuts a promo similar to Brian Pillman, not as vulgar, but to the same aspect. Like, you know, I'm here because I want to wrestle. I want to be in the main event. I don't want to be in a same show that's related to a doctor sticking his hand up guys' asses. You know, I'm here to wrestle, not be in comedy shows. And that also led to another big debut in TNA, which is Kurt Angle's.
Sure.
So Samoa Joe was in a segment where whether or not he was giving away his title, and he says, no, he's ripping up the contract, he's keeping the title, lights go out, Kurt Angle comes out, and it's like, oh my God, he's here. So it was like, those there they get so overlooked just because they're TNA, but if it wasn't for those two going to TNA, and I said it in the last segment, TNA doesn't even get talked about as a potential competitor to WWE, especially at that time.
And it's interesting you bring those two up. One, because I think Kurt Angle working with some of those younger guys, Kurt Angle had some of his best matches against Samoa Joe and AJ Styles. And being able to learn from a guy like Kurt Angle, I think those two definitely benefited from it. And you're seeing that now in the WWE. And I think Kevin Nash did a recent interview not too long ago where he even said, I think people will look back on TNA and notice how much talent actually came from that.
Oh, yeah.
And I definitely think he's right about that, because TNA, like I said earlier, I think it is looked upon as, the B show when you compare it to, the WWE or certainly even right now, New Japan or Ring of Honor, because they never really were able to compete at that level.
Right.
But they certainly did have some talent, and you see that now in Samoa Joe and AJ. But Kurt Angle's debut, when he went head-to-head with Samoa Joe, that was definitely a really cool moment in the wrestling industry.
And I think as far as storytelling perspective,
right,
probably the best debut in wrestling history as far as storytelling is Kane's.
Okay.
That whole build of, that The Undertaker burned down his parents' house and killed them and his brother, and then Paul Bearer saying, no, Kane is alive.
Yep.
And at the first ever Hell in a Cell match between Undertaker and Shawn Michaels, the lights go out, and this has got to be the best commentary for a debut, where the lights come out, it's all red,
right.
Kane's walking out, and you just hear Vince McMahon going, that's gotta be Kane! That's gotta be Kane! It was just unbelievable and great storytelling, and obviously Kane's character, that was the seed that was planted for a 20-year character that not many people, other than The Undertaker, really. And there's another great debut. The 1990 Survivor Series in Hartford, Connecticut, just down the street from us. That debut right there. The $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase, calls him out as the mystery partner of his team. And you got Gorilla Monsoon going, take a look at this guy. And comes out, tombstone pile driver on Bret Hart, eliminates him. Just two guys right there where their gimmicks just withstood the test of time, and you just can't do that in wrestling.
Right.
Especially with gimmicks, characters. The Undertaker and Kane, they got to rank among the best. So now that we kind of brought out which ones we think are the best, are there any more that you want to throw in there?
The only other one that I have on my list is Brock Lesnar's debut on Monday Night Raw when he first came out. And the only reason I have that on there, and it's similar to what you're saying, is it stood the testament of time because he came out, Paul Heyman's out there barking orders. He kicks the crap out of Spike Dudley, Maven, and Al Snow. Mm-hmm. Delivers 3 massive power bombs on Spike Dudley. And Paul Heyman's out there barking orders. And it made for, really good TV. He was working really stiff, and he was really green at the time. Mm-hmm. Had come up from OVW. And I have that on my list only because it stood the test of time. He's still with Paul Heyman, and he's about to main event SummerSlam. So that's still very impressive to see those two together and still doing their thing. But that was the only other one that I had on my list.
So we'll rank them now. We have Kane, The Undertaker, Christian Cage, Kurt Angle, Brian Pillman, Tazz, Brock Lesnar, and Jericho. Right. Those 8 right there. Right. And the outsiders, Scott Hall and the WCW. So those 9. Where does Chris Jericho rank on those? On that list?
Assuming those are the biggest within the industry, I would say Jericho's is definitely 1 or 2. The reason I say that is, like I said, Jericho came over to the WWE for opportunity. The stuff that he was doing before he got to the WWE was equally as impressive, but to see him come out the way he did, and it wasn't just the character himself, it was everything. It was the countdown and everything that led up to that moment. It was the music, it was the fireworks. As soon as that thing flashed up on the screen and you saw his name, the pop and the reaction that he got from the crowd, you could tell that he wasn't just another guy that was debuting on the show. You could tell that he was somebody special. Mm-hmm. And it definitely showed in the way he carried himself. So I think it's either 1 or 2. The only other one I would rank up there is the debut of the NWO as a true faction because of what it did for the industry, and it still does for the industry today.
I'm going to agree with you. It's definitely 1 or 2. I personally think it's the greatest of all time, the greatest debut of all time. Maybe Pillman is the only one that can compete with it. But as everything you said there, between the countdown clock, the Jericho name coming up, the pop, and throughout the thing, like, he was getting original heat because he was, trashing on WWE and their programming, which, that's a big no-no. But then he's saying he's the savior, and by the end of it, people are going to say, go, Jericho, go. And as soon as he said it, the crowd is chanting.
You missed the best part of the whole debut.
What's that?
The hairdo. The man bun of the rooster tail, whatever the hell it was. I mean, that's something that...
Paying homage to Terry Taylor there, the Red Rooster.
There's a lot of men that are still wearing that hairdo today, so that certainly stood the test of time.
Oh, yeah, of course it did. Where do you think it was among the best in wrestling history? Comment below on the YouTube page here. Subscribe, hit the bell, do all that fun stuff, and watch our videos here on YouTube.